On the morning of July 26, 1952, in a royal palace overlooking the Mediterranean Sea in Alexandria, the last king of the Muhammad Ali dynasty stood before a mirror. King Farouk I was 32 years old, but the man staring back at him barely resembled the handsome prince who had ascended the throne 16 years earlier. His face was bloated, his neck had disappeared into rolls of fat. His body was grotesquely swollen, over 300 pounds of flesh straining against his white naval uniform. His breathing was laboured. Sweat poured down his face despite the early morning cool. Outside the palace, Egyptian army tanks surrounded the gates. Soldiers with rifles patrolled the grounds. Officers stood ready with arrest warrants. Their orders were clear. The king had until noon to sign his abdication. If he refused, he would be arrested, perhaps executed. Farouk knew it was over. His reign, marked by gambling, gluttony, corruption, and humiliation, was ending. Not with dignity, not with honour, but with a fat king fleeing on a yacht while his people celebrated in the streets. At 11:55, 5 minutes before the deadline, Farouk signed the document. He abdicated in favour of his 7-month-old son, Ahmad Fuad II. But everyone knew the infant king was a fiction, a placeholder. The monarchy was finished. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Farouk boarded the royal yacht Mahrusa. He carried with him suitcases stuffed with gold, jewellery, personal documents, and, according to witnesses, an enormous collection of pornography. The yacht's engines roared to life. The vessel pulled away from Alexandria harbour. Farouk stood on the deck, watching the Egyptian coastline disappear into the haze. He would never return. And with him, the Muhammad Ali dynasty, a family that had ruled Egypt for 147 years, disappeared into history. But this ending was not inevitable. This family had once been powerful beyond imagination. They had transformed Egypt from a neglected Ottoman backwater into a modern state. They had built armies that conquered Sudan, Arabia, and Syria. They had challenged the Ottoman Empire itself and nearly defeated it. One of their rulers had invited Ferdinand de Lesseps to dig the Suez Canal, one of the most important waterways in human history. They had modernized Cairo, built palaces that rivaled Versailles, established schools and hospitals, and dreamed of creating an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. But they had also bankrupted Egypt, sold the nation's sovereignty to European powers, and ultimately lost everything through debt, incompetence, and decadence. This is the story of Egypt's last pharaohs, a dynasty that began with an illiterate Albanian mercenary who seized power through massacre, and ended with an obese playboy king fleeing into exile with stolen watches and dirty magazines. This is Egypt's last pharaohs, the Muhammad Ali dynasty. To understand how this dynasty came to power, you must first understand Egypt in the year 1800. Egypt was not an independent country. It had not been independent for over 2,000 years. Since the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC, Egypt had been ruled by foreigners: Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Mamluks, and finally, since 1517, by the Ottoman Turks. By 1800, Egypt was a province of the Ottoman Empire, the vast Turkish empire that stretched from Algeria to Iraq, from Hungary to Yemen. The Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul appointed governors called walis to administer Egypt. These governors served for a few years and were then rotated out. Egypt generated enormous wealth. The Nile River made the land incredibly fertile. Egyptian grain fed the empire. Egyptian taxes filled the Ottoman treasury. But by 1800, the Ottoman Empire was in decline. They called it the sick man of Europe. The Ottomans were losing wars to Russia, losing territory in the Balkans, losing control over their provinces. And in Egypt, real power no longer belonged to the Ottoman governors. It belonged to the Mamluks. The Mamluks were a warrior caste. Originally, they had been slave soldiers, boys bought or captured from the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Balkans, brought to Egypt, converted to Islam, and trained as elite cavalry. For centuries, they had served the rulers of Egypt, but over time, they became a power unto themselves. By 1800, there were roughly 24 powerful Mamluk families, called Beys, who controlled vast estates, collected taxes, and commanded private armies. The Ottoman governor in Cairo was essentially powerless. The Mamluks ruled Egypt, but they did not rule it well. The Mamluk beys constantly fought among themselves, shifting alliances, petty wars, assassinations, feuds over land and revenues. Egypt was wealthy but chaotic, a land of warlords. And then, in 1798, everything changed. On July 1st, 1798, a French fleet appeared off the coast of Alexandria. General Napoleon Bonaparte, the young military genius of the French Revolution, had invaded Egypt. Napoleon landed with 40,000 troops. His goal, to cut off Britain's trade route to India, establish a French empire in the Middle East, and perhaps emulate Alexander the Great. The Mamluk beys, confident in their cavalry, rode out to stop him. At the Battle of the Pyramids on July 21st, 1798, the Mamluks charged. Thousands of horsemen in brilliant armour carrying swords and muskets thundered across the desert toward the French lines. They were slaughtered. Napoleon's disciplined infantry, arranged in defensive squares, unleashed devastating volleys of musket fire and artillery. The Mamluk cavalry broke. Hundreds were killed. The survivors fled. Napoleon occupied Cairo. For the next 3 years, French soldiers camped in the shadow of the pyramids. French engineers surveyed Egypt. French scholars, the savants who accompanied Napoleon, studied its ancient monuments, creating the foundation for modern Egyptology. But Napoleon's adventure in Egypt was a disaster. The British Navy, commanded by Admiral Horatio Nelson, destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of Aboukir Bay in August 1798. Napoleon's army was trapped. Disease ravaged the French troops: dysentery, plague, ophthalmia, an eye infection that blinded thousands of soldiers. Thousands died. In 1799, Napoleon attempted to march into Syria to open an overland route back to France. He laid siege to the fortress city of Acre. For 2 months, French troops assaulted the walls, but the city held. The British Navy supplied the defenders. Plague swept through the French camp. Napoleon was forced to retreat. Defeated and humiliated, Napoleon abandoned his army and fled back to France in August 1799, sneaking past British blockades on a fast frigate. The British and a fresh Ottoman army arrived in 1801 and drove the remaining French forces out of Egypt. But Egypt was now in ruins. The Mamluks were weakened. The Ottomans were trying to reassert control, and the economy was devastated. Into this chaos walked a man who would change everything. His name was Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was born in 1769 in the small port town of Kavala in Ottoman Macedonia, in what is now northern Greece. He was not Egyptian. He was not Arab. He was Albanian. His father, Ibrahim Aga, was a local militia commander and tobacco merchant. His mother died when he was young. Muhammad Ali received almost no formal education. He could barely read and write. But he was intelligent, cunning, ruthless, and ambitious. As a young man, Muhammad Ali joined the Ottoman military as a mercenary. When the Ottomans assembled an army to expel the French from Egypt, Muhammad Ali went with them as a junior officer, commanding a small unit of 300 Albanian soldiers. He arrived in Egypt in 1801. He was 32 years old, a minor commander in a foreign land, no wealth, no connections, no title. But he had something else, an extraordinary ability to read people, to form alliances, and to wait for the perfect moment to strike. And he had no intention of leaving. For the next 4 years, Egypt descended into chaos. The Ottomans tried to install governors to rule Egypt, but the governors had no real authority. The Mamluks still controlled the countryside. The Mamluk beys fought among themselves, forming and breaking alliances, waging small wars over revenues and land. The British briefly occupied Alexandria, trying to prevent Napoleon from returning. It was a disaster. Nobody was in control. Muhammad Ali watched and learned. He cultivated relationships with the Mamluk beys, presenting himself as a neutral mediator. He made alliances with Egyptian religious leaders, the ulama, who had influence over the population. He slowly built loyalty among the Ottoman troops, especially the Albanian regiments who shared his language and culture. He was patient, calculating, always friendly, always helpful, never threatening. In 1804, the people of Cairo rioted against the Ottoman governor, demanding his removal. The ulama, the religious scholars, issued a declaration. They wanted Muhammad Ali as the new governor of Egypt. The Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, unable to impose his own choice and desperate for stability, reluctantly agreed. On May 17, 1805, Muhammad Ali was officially appointed Wali of Egypt, the Ottoman governor. He was supposed to be a temporary administrator, loyal to Istanbul, governing Egypt on behalf of the Sultan. Instead, he would become the founder of a dynasty that ruled Egypt for 147 years. But first, he had to eliminate the Mamluks. Muhammad Ali knew that as long as the Mamluks existed, his power would be limited. They still controlled vast estates across Egypt. They still commanded private armies. They still collected taxes. If he tried to confront them directly, they would destroy him. He had only a few thousand Albanian soldiers. The Mamluks could field tens of thousands of cavalry. So he waited. For 6 years, Muhammad Ali played the game. He invited Mamluk beys to serve in his administration. He attended their feasts. He gave them gifts. He pretended to be their ally. But in secret, he was building his own power base. He recruited loyal Albanian, Turkish and Kurdish soldiers. He began training them in European military tactics. He imported French and Italian military advisors. He secured control over Egypt's customs revenues, using the money to pay his troops. And he waited for the perfect moment. In 1811, Muhammad Ali announced that his son, Tusun Pasha, would lead an expedition to Arabia. The Wahhabis, religious extremists from Central Arabia, had seized the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. They had destroyed shrines, banned music and tobacco, and declared all other Muslims heretics. The Ottoman Sultan wanted them crushed. Muhammad Ali volunteered his army for the mission. To celebrate Tusun's departure, Muhammad Ali announced a grand ceremony at the Cairo citadel on March 1, 1811. He invited all the Mamluk beys and their retinues, a gesture of respect, a farewell celebration before the Arabian campaign. On the morning of March 1st, the Mamluks arrived at the citadel. 470 Mamluk beys dressed in their finest silk robes and jeweled turbans, accompanied by their armed guards. The ceremony was held in the main courtyard. There were speeches praising Tusun's mission. Gifts were exchanged. Coffee and sweets were served. Everyone was smiling. When the ceremony ended, the Mamluks mounted their horses and began to leave. They rode in a long procession through a narrow, winding passageway that led from the citadel down to the street. Below, high stone walls rose on both sides. The passage was only wide enough for 3 or 4 horses abreast. It descended steeply, twisting between fortress walls. The Mamluks rode slowly, their horses' hooves clattering on the stones. And then the gates slammed shut behind them. Muhammad Ali's Albanian soldiers appeared on the walls above. Hundreds of them. They raised their muskets, and they opened fire. The Mamluks, trapped in the narrow passage with no room to maneuver, were slaughtered. Horses screamed and reared. Men fell from their saddles, blood pouring from musket wounds. Bodies piled up in the narrow corridor. Those who tried to charge back toward the citadel were met by locked gates and more gunfire. Those who tried to ride forward were cut down by volleys from soldiers positioned at the exit. Within minutes, 470 Mamluk beys were dead or dying. A few tried to escape by leaping their horses off the citadel walls, a drop of over 30 feet. Most were killed in the fall. One, according to legend, survived by jumping his horse off the wall and somehow landing safely. His name was Amin Bey. He fled to Upper Egypt and was never seen again. The rest were slaughtered. Over the following days and weeks, Muhammad Ali's forces hunted down the remaining Mamluk families across Cairo and throughout Egypt. Estates were confiscated. Houses were burned. Women and children were expelled or killed. Survivors fled south to Sudan or hid in remote villages. The Mamluk power structure, which had dominated Egypt for over 5 centuries, was destroyed in a single afternoon. Muhammad Ali now had absolute control over Egypt, and he intended to use it. Muhammad Ali was not interested in simply administering Egypt as a provincial Ottoman governor. He had a vision. He wanted to build a modern state, a powerful army, an empire. To do that, he needed money, lots of it, and he needed to transform Egypt's economy. Muhammad Ali began by nationalizing Egypt's agricultural land. Officially, all land now belonged to the state. Peasants no longer owned their farms. They worked state land and were required to sell their crops to the government at fixed prices. Muhammad Ali forced Egyptian farmers to grow cash crops, cotton, sugarcane, indigo. The state bought these crops cheaply and sold them abroad at enormous profit. It was brutal. Peasants had no choice. If they refused, soldiers came and forced them. If villages resisted, they were punished, sometimes burned. But it worked. Egypt's revenues soared. Muhammad Ali also established state monopolies on nearly every major industry: textiles, armaments, shipbuilding, mining, salt. Private enterprise was essentially banned. Everything was controlled by the state. It was a command economy, modelled loosely on the mercantilist systems of Europe, but taken to an extreme. And it generated massive wealth for Muhammad Ali and his government. With that money, he began to transform Egypt. He hired European engineers, military advisors, and doctors, hundreds of them. French engineers designed factories and irrigation systems. Italian doctors established hospitals. British officers trained his troops. One of his most important advisors was a French doctor named Antoine Clot, who became known as Clot Bey. Clot established Egypt's first modern medical school and trained Egyptian doctors in European medicine. Another key advisor was a French military officer named Octave Joseph Antelme Sèvres, who converted to Islam, took the name Suleiman Pasha, and reorganized Egypt's army along European lines. Muhammad Ali built Egypt's first modern printing press in 1822 and began publishing books in Arabic on science, medicine, engineering, and military tactics. He established schools. He sent Egyptian students, hundreds of them, to Europe, to Paris, London, Milan, to study medicine, engineering, military science, chemistry, languages. He wanted Egypt to have its own trained professionals, not rely on foreigners forever. He drained swamps, built irrigation canals, and expanded agricultural production. He modernized Cairo, constructing new neighborhoods, paving roads, installing gas lighting. He built factories to produce textiles, weapons, gunpowder, and ships, and most importantly, he built an army. For centuries, Egyptians had been ruled by foreign military castes: Mamluks, Ottomans, Turks. Egyptian peasants were considered too weak, too cowardly, too undisciplined to be soldiers. Muhammad Ali changed that. He instituted conscription, forcing Egyptian peasants into military service. At first, the conscripts hated it. Many mutilated themselves, cutting off fingers, blinding themselves, to avoid service. Some villages rioted when conscription officers arrived. But Muhammad Ali was ruthless. Those who refused were punished. Entire villages could be burned if they resisted. Families of deserters were imprisoned. Slowly, painfully, he built an army. French officers trained them in European drill and tactics. Egyptian arsenals manufactured rifles, cannons, and gunpowder. By the 1820s, Muhammad Ali commanded over 100,000 troops, disciplined, well-equipped, and loyal. He now had the most powerful army in the Middle East, and he was ready to use it. Muhammad Ali's first military campaign was not for conquest. It was on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan. In 1811, the same year as the Mamluk massacre, the Ottoman Sultan asked Muhammad Ali to send an army to Arabia to crush the Wahhabis. The Wahhabis, led by the Saud family, had created a puritanical Islamic state in central Arabia. They had seized the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. They declared the Ottoman Sultan, who claimed to be the Caliph of Islam, a heretic. This was intolerable. Muhammad Ali agreed to lead the campaign. It was an opportunity to prove his loyalty to Istanbul and to expand his influence. In 1811, Muhammad Ali sent his son Tusun Pasha with an army of 8,000 troops to Arabia. The Arabian campaign was a nightmare. The terrain was brutal, endless desert, scorching heat and no water. The Wahhabis fought a guerrilla war, ambushing Egyptian columns and disappearing into the desert. Tusun's army suffered heavy casualties. Thousands of soldiers died from thirst, heat, and disease. But Tusun pressed on. In 1812, he captured Medina. In 1813, he captured Mecca. But the Wahhabi forces were not defeated. They continued to raid Egyptian positions from bases in central Arabia. In 1816, Muhammad Ali sent his other son, Ibrahim Pasha, with reinforcements. Ibrahim was a far more capable general than Tusun. He was ruthless, intelligent, and relentless. Ibrahim launched a campaign of total war. He marched into the heart of Arabia, the Najd region, burning villages, destroying wells, massacring resistance. In 1818, Ibrahim captured the Wahhabi capital, Diriyah. He razed the city to the ground. He captured Abdullah ibn Saud, the Wahhabi leader, and sent him in chains to Istanbul, where he was publicly beheaded. The Wahhabi state was destroyed. Muhammad Ali had secured the holy cities for the Ottoman Sultan. He had proven his loyalty, and he had demonstrated the power of his army. But the Arabian campaign had cost him dearly. Thousands of soldiers dead, millions of pounds spent. Muhammad Ali expected to be rewarded. He was not. In 1823, the Ottoman Sultan asked Muhammad Ali for help again. Greece was in revolt. Greek rebels were fighting for independence from Ottoman rule. The Sultan needed troops to crush the rebellion. Muhammad Ali agreed, but only in exchange for territory. He demanded control of Crete and Syria. The Sultan, desperate, agreed. Muhammad Ali sent Ibrahim Pasha with an Egyptian fleet and 10,000 soldiers to Greece. Ibrahim landed in the Peloponnese, the southern peninsula of Greece, in February 1825. Ibrahim was a brilliant, ruthless commander. He devastated the Greek countryside. His troops burned villages, massacred civilians, enslaved prisoners, and crushed rebel forces. Ibrahim's strategy was scorched earth. He intended to depopulate the Peloponnese and replace the Greek population with Egyptian settlers. For 3 years, Ibrahim waged a brutal campaign in Greece. But the European powers, Britain, France, and Russia, supported Greek independence. They saw the Ottoman Empire as weak and backwards. They wanted Greece to be free. The Europeans sent fleets to Greek waters. They warned Muhammad Ali and the Sultan, withdraw or face war. Muhammad Ali ignored them. On October 20th, 1827, the combined British, French, and Russian fleets confronted the Egyptian and Ottoman navies in the Bay of Navarino. The European ships were larger, faster, and better armed. The Battle of Navarino was a massacre. The European fleets destroyed the Egyptian and Ottoman navies. 60 ships sunk or captured, thousands of sailors killed. Ibrahim was forced to withdraw from Greece. Muhammad Ali's gamble had failed. He gained nothing. His navy was gone. His soldiers had died for nothing. But Muhammad Ali was not finished. In 1831, the Ottoman Sultan refused to honor his promise to grant Muhammad Ali control of Syria. Muhammad Ali decided to take it by force. On October 31st, 1831, Egyptian forces crossed into Palestine. They swept through Gaza, Jaffa, and Acre. The Ottoman garrisons collapsed. Ibrahim Pasha led the invasion. He was now Muhammad Ali's most trusted general, capable, ruthless, and loyal. By May 1832, Ibrahim had captured Damascus. Then he kept going. Ibrahim marched north into Anatolia, the heartland of the Ottoman Empire itself. Ottoman armies tried to stop him. They were crushed. At the Battle of Konya, on December 21st, 1832, Ibrahim destroyed the main Ottoman army. Over 15,000 Ottoman soldiers were killed or captured. The Grand Vizier, the Ottoman Prime Minister, was captured. The Ottoman commander was wounded and fled. The road to Istanbul, the Ottoman capital, was open. The Ottoman Sultan, Mahmud II, panicked. His empire was collapsing. His army was destroyed. An Egyptian army was marching on his capital. He begged the European powers for help. Russia responded first. Tsar Nicholas I sent Russian warships to the Bosphorus to defend Istanbul. Russian troops prepared to land. Britain and France also intervened. They warned Muhammad Ali if he marched on Istanbul, they would declare war. Muhammad Ali realized he could not fight all of Europe. In May 1833, Muhammad Ali agreed to a settlement. He would withdraw from Anatolia, but he would keep Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and the province of Adana in southern Anatolia. For the next 9 years, Muhammad Ali ruled an empire stretching from Sudan in the south to the Taurus Mountains in the north. Egypt was no longer just an Ottoman province. It was a regional superpower. Ibrahim governed Syria as viceroy. He attempted to modernize the region, building schools, reforming the tax system, conscripting locals into the army. But the Syrians resented Egyptian rule. Rebellions broke out. Ibrahim crushed them with extreme violence. Meanwhile, the European powers, especially Britain, watched Muhammad Ali with growing alarm. If Egypt became too powerful, it could threaten British trade routes to India. Britain could not allow that. The Ottoman Sultan also wanted revenge. In 1839, encouraged by Britain, the Ottoman Sultan launched a new war to retake Syria. The Ottoman army marched south across the Taurus Mountains. It was a massive force, over 70,000 troops. And once again, Ibrahim Pasha crushed them. At the Battle of Nazib on June 24th, 1839, Ibrahim destroyed the Ottoman army. 10,000 Ottomans were killed. The survivors fled in panic. Days later, the Ottoman Sultan Mahmud II died, possibly of a heart attack brought on by the humiliation. His teenage son, Abdulmajid I, became the new sultan, and the European powers decided enough was enough. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia formed a coalition. They issued an ultimatum. Muhammad Ali must withdraw from Syria and recognize Ottoman sovereignty or face war. British warships bombarded Beirut and Acre. British and Austrian troops prepared to land. The Royal Navy blockaded the Egyptian coast. Muhammad Ali, now 70 years old, exhausted and facing the combined might of Europe, realized he could not win. In 1841, he agreed to a settlement. He would withdraw from Syria and Adana. He would reduce his army to 18,000 men. He would pay annual tribute to the Ottoman Sultan. He would recognize Ottoman sovereignty. In return, the Ottoman Sultan issued a firman, an official decree, making the governorship of Egypt hereditary in the Muhammad Ali family. The dynasty was now official, but Muhammad Ali had lost his empire. Syria was gone. His dreams of challenging the Ottomans and creating a great Middle Eastern empire were over, and he was broken. In his final years, Muhammad Ali's mind deteriorated. Historians believe he suffered from dementia or a series of strokes. He would wander the palace halls, confused. Sometimes he did not recognize his own sons. He spoke to people who were not there. He relived old battles, shouting orders to phantom armies. His wives and servants tried to care for him, but there was nothing they could do. In 1848, he was declared mentally unfit to rule. His son Ibrahim became regent, but Ibrahim was dying. Tuberculosis was destroying his lungs. He coughed blood constantly. He could barely breathe. Ibrahim ruled for only 6 months before he died on November 10th, 1848. He was 59 years old. Muhammad Ali died less than a year later, on August 2nd, 1849, at the age of 80. He had ruled Egypt for 44 years. He had transformed a neglected province into a modern state. He had built an empire and lost it. He had challenged the Ottoman Sultan and the European powers. He had been the most powerful ruler in the Middle East. But his dynasty would continue for another century. After Muhammad Ali's death, Egypt was ruled by a succession of rulers, khedives and later kings, who were wealthy and ambitious but increasingly dominated by European powers. Muhammad Ali's immediate successors tried to continue his modernization projects. They built railways, telegraph lines, modern hospitals, factories, but they also borrowed enormous sums of money from European banks to fund these projects. And they lived extravagantly. Abbas I, Muhammad Ali's grandson, ruled from 1849 to 1854. He was paranoid, reclusive, and cruel. He hated Europeans and tried to reverse many of Muhammad Ali's reforms. He He was murdered in his palace in July 1854, possibly by his own servants, possibly by rivals. The truth was never established. Said Pasha, Muhammad Ali's youngest son, ruled from 1854 to 1863. He was more liberal and reform-minded than Abbas. He abolished slavery in Egypt. He improved relations with Europe. Said was a close friend of Ferdinand de Lesseps, a French diplomat and engineer who had lived in Egypt during Muhammad Ali's time. And in 1854, Said made one of the most consequential decisions in Egyptian history. He granted de Lesseps a concession to dig a canal connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, the Suez Canal. Construction began in April 1859. It was an engineering marvel, over 100 miles long, dug through desert sand and salt marshes. The project took 10 years. Thousands of Egyptian workers were conscripted to dig it. They worked with shovels and pickaxes in brutal heat. Conditions were horrific. Workers were beaten. Many died from exhaustion, heat stroke, dehydration, and disease. Estimates of the death toll range from thousands to tens of thousands. But the canal was completed. When it opened on November 17th, 1869, it was celebrated as one of the greatest achievements of the modern age. European royalty attended the opening ceremony. Verdi's opera, Aida, was commissioned for the occasion. The canal cut the journey from Europe to India by thousands of miles. It transformed global trade. But Egypt owned only 44% of the shares in the Suez Canal Company. The rest were owned by France. And by the time the canal opened, Egypt was ruled by a new Khedive, Ismail the Magnificent. Ismail Pasha became Khedive in 1863 at the age of 33. He was Muhammad Ali's grandson, and he was ambitious, visionary, and reckless. Ismail wanted to make Egypt the Paris of the Middle East. He rebuilt Cairo with wide boulevards modelled on Haussmann's Paris. He installed gas street lighting. He built an opera house, the Khedivial Opera House, where Verdi's Aida premiered. He constructed European-style palaces, public gardens, museums, a modern postal system, telegraph lines connecting Egypt to Europe. He expanded Egypt's military and conquered parts of Sudan, Eritrea, and Somalia. He sent expeditions to Uganda and Ethiopia. He bribed the Ottoman Sultan with millions of pounds to grant him the title Khedive, a Persian word meaning viceroy, which gave him more autonomy than previous governors. Ismail's Egypt was modern, cosmopolitan, and wealthy on the surface, but it was built on debt. Ismail borrowed relentlessly from European banks. He took out loans at exorbitant interest rates, sometimes 15 or 20%, to fund his projects. By 1875, Egypt's foreign debt had reached over 100 million British pounds. Annual interest payments consumed more than half of Egypt's government revenue. Ismail was drowning in debt, and the European creditors were circling like sharks. In 1875, desperate for cash, Ismail decided to sell Egypt's 44% stake in the Suez Canal Company. The French were negotiating to buy it. But the British Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, moved faster. He sent a message to Lionel de Rothschild, head of the Rothschild banking family in London, asking for an immediate loan of £4 million. Rothschild agreed within 24 hours. No paperwork, no formal contract, just a handshake and trust. Britain bought Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal. Egypt had just sold control of its most valuable asset, the waterway that connected Europe to Asia, to a foreign power for a fraction of its true value. And things only got worse. In 1876, Egypt defaulted on its debt payments. European creditors demanded immediate action. Britain and France established the Caisse de la Dette Publique, a debt commission that took over Egypt's finances. European officials now controlled how Egypt spent money. They collected taxes, they dictated economic policy, they supervised government departments. Egypt was independent in name only. Ismail tried to resist. He dismissed European advisors. He attempted to reassert Egyptian sovereignty. In 1879, under pressure from European powers, the Ottoman Sultan deposed Ismail. Ismail was forced into exile. He lived the rest of his life in Istanbul and Naples, dying in 1895. He was replaced by his son, Tewfik Pasha. Tewfik was weak, pliable, and controlled by European advisors. Many Egyptians saw him as a traitor, a puppet of the British and French. In 1881, resentment boiled over into revolt. Colonel Ahmad Urabi, an Egyptian army officer, led a nationalist movement demanding Egypt for the Egyptians. Urabi was a charismatic leader. He came from a peasant background, rare for an Egyptian officer. He spoke eloquently about Egyptian sovereignty, justice, and resistance to foreign control. He called for the expulsion of foreign influence, the restoration of Egyptian sovereignty, an end to European financial control. Constitutional government. Urabi's movement gained mass support. Soldiers rallied to him. So did intellectuals, religious leaders, merchants, and ordinary Egyptians. In September 1881, Urabi led a military demonstration in Cairo. Thousands of soldiers marched on the Khedive's palace. Urabi presented a list of demands. Tewfik, terrified, agreed to everything. For several months, Urabi effectively controlled Egypt, but the British government, fearing for the Suez Canal and European investments, decided to act. In July 1882, British warships bombarded Alexandria. The city was set ablaze. Hundreds of Egyptians were killed. Much of the European quarter burned. In September 1882, a British expeditionary force of 25,000 troops landed in Egypt and marched toward Cairo. At the Battle of Tel el-Kebir on September 13th, 1882, British forces, using modern rifles, machine guns, and artillery, routed Urabi's army in less than an hour. Egyptian casualties were in the thousands. British casualties were minimal. Urabi was captured and put on trial. He was convicted of rebellion and sentenced to death. But the British commuted his sentence to exile. He was sent to Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, where he lived until 1911. Britain occupied Egypt. Officially, Egypt remained an Ottoman province. Tewfik remained Khedive. The government continued to function, but everyone knew the truth. Real power belonged to Britain. British troops garrisoned Egypt. British officials, led by the Consul General, Lord Cromer, ran the government. The Khedives were figureheads. Tewfik ruled until 1892. He died of illness, possibly poisoning, though this was never proven. His son, Abbas Hilmi II, became Khedive at age 18. Abbas was more independent-minded than his father. He resented British control. He tried to assert Egyptian sovereignty. He cultivated relationships with Ottoman and French officials. But the British Consul General, Lord Cromer, ruled Egypt in all but name. Every time Abbas challenged him, Cromer overruled him. If Abbas dismissed a minister Cromer liked, Cromer forced him to reinstate the minister. Abbas learned to keep his mouth shut. When World War I broke out in 1914, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. Britain, at war with the Ottomans, formally severed Egypt's connection to the Ottoman Empire. Abbas, who had Ottoman sympathies, was deposed while travelling abroad. He was forbidden from returning to Egypt. He was replaced by his uncle Hussein Kamal. Britain declared Egypt a protectorate. Hussein Kamal was given the title Sultan of Egypt. It was a symbolic upgrade. But Hussein had no real power. British officials still controlled everything. When Hussein died in 1917, his brother Fuad became Sultan. After World War I, Egyptian nationalists demanded independence. A delegation led by Saad Zaghloul, a prominent lawyer and politician, asked to present Egypt's case at the Paris Peace Conference. The British refused. In March 1919, the British arrested Zaghloul and exiled him to Malta. Egypt exploded. Massive protests erupted across the country. Students, workers, women, peasants, Egyptians of all classes took to the streets. British soldiers fired on protesters. Hundreds were killed. The 1919 Revolution, as it came to be known, forced Britain to make concessions. In 1922, Britain formally ended the protectorate and recognised Egypt as an independent kingdom. Fuad became King Fuad I, but British troops remained in Egypt. Britain still controlled the Suez Canal. British advisors still dominated Egyptian foreign policy and defence. It was independence in name only. King Fuad ruled until 1936. He was autocratic, paranoid, and obsessed with asserting royal power against Egypt's new parliament. Egypt now had a constitution and an elected parliament, but Fuad constantly clashed with elected politicians. He dissolved parliament repeatedly. He ruled by decree. Fuad was also physically disabled. As a young man, he had been shot in the throat during an assassination attempt. The bullet damaged his larynx. For the rest of his life, his voice was high-pitched and weak. This humiliation made him bitter and authoritarian. When Fuad died of a heart attack on April 28, 1936, his 16-year-old son inherited the throne. King Farouk I. Farouk ascended the throne on May 8, 1936, at the age of 16. At first, Egyptians loved him. He was young, handsome, and charming. He had striking green eyes and a warm smile. He gave speeches promising reform. He drove through Cairo in an open car, waving to cheering crowds. Egyptians hoped he would be different from his father, a modernizer, a nationalist, a king who would restore Egypt's dignity and independence. But Farouk had no interest in reform. He had no interest in politics. He had no interest in governing. Farouk loved luxury. He loved pleasure. And he was lazy. Farouk collected cars, hundreds of them, Rolls Royces, Bentleys, Cadillacs, Ferraris, Maseratis, Alfa Romeos. He had them painted red so other drivers would know to get out of his way. He drove recklessly through Cairo, racing through the streets, running red lights, causing accidents. He loved gambling. He spent nights at Cairo's casinos, the Royal Automobile Club, the Muhammad Ali Club, losing enormous sums at roulette and poker tables. He loved women. He had countless mistresses, actresses, dancers, socialites. He cheated on his wife constantly. In 1938, Farouk married Farida, a beautiful Egyptian woman from an aristocratic family. At first they seemed happy, but Farouk's infidelities destroyed the marriage. They had 3 daughters but no sons. In Egyptian culture, this was a disaster. Farouk blamed Farida. He humiliated her publicly. He flaunted his mistresses. And Farouk loved food. He ate compulsively. Breakfast, a dozen eggs, steaks, pastries, fruit. Lunch, multiple courses of meat, rice, pasta, desserts. Dinner, the same. Late night snacks, lobster, oysters, caviar, champagne. By his mid-20s, Farouk was overweight. By his late 20s, he weighed over 250 pounds. By his early 30s, over 300. His face became bloated. His neck disappeared. His body became grotesque. He could barely walk without sweating and gasping for breath. But Egypt was facing serious crises. The economy was stagnant. Most Egyptians were desperately poor. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite. The royal family, large landowners, foreign investors. British troops still occupied Egypt, controlling the Suez Canal and dominating foreign policy. And Egyptian politicians were corrupt and ineffective. Parliament was dominated by the Wafd party, which claimed to represent the people but was riddled with corruption and infighting. In 1948, Egypt joined other Arab states in a war against the newly declared State of Israel. It was a catastrophe. The Egyptian army was poorly equipped. Officers had embezzled funds meant for weapons and supplies. Soldiers were sent into battle with defective rifles, insufficient ammunition, and outdated equipment. Israeli forces, outnumbered but better organized, better trained, and more motivated, defeated the Egyptian army decisively. Egyptian soldiers died in the desert. Some starved. Some were captured. Some fled. When the survivors returned home, they were humiliated and furious. They blamed the politicians who had profited from arms deals while sending soldiers to die with faulty weapons. And they blamed King Farouk, who had been gambling and eating while Egyptian soldiers were dying. Within the army, a group of young officers began meeting in secret. They called themselves the Free Officers Movement. Their leader was a charismatic colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was born in 1918 in Alexandria. He came from a modest background. His father was a postal worker. He had joined the army and distinguished himself as an officer, Nasser believed Egypt needed a revolution. The monarchy had to go, the British had to leave, the corrupt politicians had to be removed, and Egypt had to be ruled by Egyptians, not foreigners, not kings, not corrupt landowners. The free officers began planning. They recruited members carefully, they held secret meetings, they stockpiled weapons. By 1952, they were ready. On the night of July 22nd to 23rd, 1952, the free officers launched their coup. They seized military headquarters in Cairo. They took control of radio stations. They surrounded government buildings. They blocked roads leading to the royal palaces. By morning, they controlled the capital. King Farouk, isolated in his palace in Alexandria, surrounded by tanks and soldiers, realized he had no options. The free officers sent him an ultimatum: abdicate by noon on July 26th, or face arrest and execution. Farouk tried to negotiate. He called the British ambassador, begging for help. The British refused. He offered to appoint new ministers. He promised reforms. The free officers refused. At 11:55 on the morning of July 26, 5 minutes before the deadline, Farouk signed his abdication. He named his 7-month-old son, Ahmad Fuad II, as king. But everyone knew it was meaningless. The monarchy was finished. That afternoon, Farouk boarded the royal yacht Mahrusa at Alexandria Harbour. He carried with him suitcases filled with gold coins, jewellery, personal documents, and, according to multiple witnesses, an enormous collection of pornography, thousands of photographs and films. As the yacht pulled away from the dock, a 21-gun salute was fired. Farouk stood on the deck watching the Egyptian coastline disappear. He would never see Egypt again. Farouk spent the rest of his life in exile in Rome and Monaco. He lived in luxury, renting suites at the best hotels, dining at expensive restaurants, gambling at Italian and French casinos. But he was alone. His wife Farida had divorced him in 1948. His daughters wanted nothing to do with him. His former courtiers and friends avoided him. Farouk remarried in 1951, before the coup, to a 16-year-old girl named Nariman Sadek. She gave him a son, Ahmad Fuad. But the marriage was miserable. After the coup, Nariman left him. She later divorced him and remarried. Farouk ate constantly. His weight ballooned to over 350 pounds. He became a figure of ridicule. Italian tabloids mocked him. He was photographed stuffing food into his mouth, sweating, surrounded by sycophants. On March 18, 1965, Farouk collapsed in a Rome restaurant after eating a massive meal: oysters, lobster, roast lamb, multiple desserts. He died of a heart attack. He was 45 years old. When his belongings were auctioned, they included 200 cars, a vast collection of pornography, stolen jewellery, and a pocket watch that had once belonged to Winston Churchill. Farouk had pickpocketed it during a diplomatic reception in Cairo during World War II. The last king of Egypt died obese, alone and forgotten. In 1953, the free officers officially abolished the monarchy. Egypt was declared a republic. Gamal Abdel Nasser became president. The Muhammad Ali dynasty was over. Today, the Muhammad Ali dynasty is a historical footnote. The palaces they built still stand in Cairo and Alexandria, converted into museums, government offices and hotels. The Abdeen Palace, the Montaza Palace, the Manial Palace. Tourists visit them, take photographs, and learn about Egypt's royal past. The Suez Canal they helped construct remains one of the most important waterways in the world, carrying over 12% of global trade, trillions of dollars in goods every year. But the family itself is gone. Some descendants live quietly in Europe, Egypt, and the United States. Prince Muhammad Ali, a distant relative, lives in Cairo and advocates for constitutional monarchy. But he has no political power. No one takes him seriously. The last nominal king, Ahmad Fuad II, Farouk's infant son, lives in Switzerland. He is now in his 70s. He calls himself King Fuad II of Egypt and Sudan. But no one recognizes his claim. Egypt is now ruled by military strongmen, a pattern that began with Nasser in 1952 and continues today under President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, himself a former general. The dream of an independent Egypt ruled by an Egyptian dynasty ended in 1952. but the legacy of Muhammad Ali remains. He showed that a man with no education, no wealth, no royal blood, just intelligence, ruthlessness, and ambition, could seize power and transform a nation. He modernized Egypt. He built armies that challenged empires. He turned a neglected province into a regional power. But he also laid the foundation for Egypt's subordination to European powers. He borrowed. He spent beyond his means. He built an empire that collapsed the moment European powers pushed back. His successors inherited his ambitions, but not his discipline. They borrowed recklessly. They sold Egypt's sovereignty piece by piece, the Suez Canal, financial control, military occupation. And they lived extravagantly while the Egyptian people suffered. The Muhammad Ali dynasty ruled Egypt for 147 years. They were Egypt's last pharaohs. And they ended not with glory or dignity, but with a 300-pound king fleeing on a yacht, leaving behind a country occupied, impoverished, and humiliated. Power fades, monuments crumble, but history remembers, and history judges harshly those who squander greatness for pleasure. This has been Egypt's last pharaohs, the Muhammad Ali dynasty. This has been Bloodline Chronicles.